Welcome back to the Eras of Podcast. I am Pastor Paige.
And I'm Pastor Megan, and we are so glad you are back with us on this journey with season 2.
Yeah, you may have noticed we called ourselves something a little different. We are leaning into a new podcast title, I guess.
Perhaps maybe we could even say a new era.
A new era, right?
Yes.
So we are going to still be Pastor Swifties.
Mm-hmm.
And our first season was Eras of Christ. So this season, we are going to do the Eras of, drumroll,
God.
the Eras of God, which is a really good opportunity to continue to explore Taylor Swift's music,
Yes.
but also our understanding of faith
Mm-hmm.
and the workings of the divine here now and in the past.
Yes. So for the next several weeks, months, we will be looking at the eras of Taylor Swift again, but with God this time.
Yeah, that means that we'll also be focusing on stories from a different part of the Bible.
Yeah, so last season was all Jesus, so it was natural to look at the New Testament and specifically the Gospels.
Right.
Whereas this time we are looking at a different part of the Bible.
Yeah.
We're looking at the beginning.
Right.
The front 3/4.
I think it's something like that. Yeah.
You know, I'm not good with fractions. So the front half of the Bible, also known as the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah. And this part of scripture is a lot longer than the Gospels or the New Testament at all. I mean, last time we stuck with 4 books.
Yeah.
That was it, the 4 Gospels.
Yeah.
This time we're going to be exploring a lot more scripture, we just have a lot more to pull from.
Yes. And don't worry, we will get back to the New Testament. That might be another season, so stick around for that. But stick around with us right now as we tell you what this new season's going to look like.
Yeah. So we are going to go album by album as we did the first season. And we're going to tie that to the stories of the earliest part of scripture and looking at how people over time understood the presence of God, who God was, how God was in their lives. And again, we'll tie that to the stories that Taylor tells.
Yes. So when we were planning this last week, Paige had a beautiful idea to start at the end of Taylor with Midnights. Part of it was because I don't think either one of us were ready to listen to Debut.
Yeah.
Because she's very young in that album. But as we were planning out, and, you know, I think you learned this all a lot last season with us, is that we think we know what we're planning, but then we get to it and we sit down and we're like, wait, actually. So we did that. We sat down and we had our Post-its up on our wall. You saw the post on our social media last week. And we realized as we started putting stories in and ideas that we have to start in the beginning.
Right.
We can't just skip to the end. You know, so we will be starting at the beginning of the Bible and at the beginning of Taylor with Debut.
Yeah. And I think that it's a really great opportunity to explore again how we grow and change in our faith, and not just as individuals, but even as people over time.
Yeah.
The Hebrew scriptures also can be a lot harder to apply to our world or to understand what they really mean.
Yeah. And before we get too far, I want to mention, I mentioned it when I talked about what part of the Bible we're going to be looking at. Paige and I are going to interchange Old Testament and Hebrew Bible a lot. They are called both, so please don't get confused if you hear one of us saying one thing and then later on saying the other. We just want to let you know we are talking about the same thing. But as most things with the Bible, with our faith, you can call it many different things.
Right.
So
yeah, and we'll That's really important, right? Because the perspective that we bring into this comes both from our own experiences, but also our educational backgrounds,
Yeah.
right? We both have Masters of Divinity degrees, which does not mean we've mastered the divine.
It does not. It just gave us the initials at the end of our name, but that's about it.
And the resources to,
Yes.
understand and dive in, look at scripture more deeply. And one of the things that I learned a lot about when I was in seminary was thinking about how it is that we see scripture as a whole. And one of the reasons we wanted to do an intro for our second season was to cover that in particular, but also to share with you some changes for how we'll do the podcast and some different things like that. First of all, if you're watching the video, you may see we have new microphones. If you're listening, you may hear better audio quality.
Yeah.
So we decided to invest in our podcast and make some changes there. So hopefully you can hear us better.
Or see us clearer if you're watching us on YouTube. Hi, Auntie.
Right? And we have also learned a little bit about what it takes to put out a podcast.
Yes, and we want to give you guys a good product, one that we are proud of. We were very proud of season 1, but we want to keep doing this. So I think each season we're going to evolve a little bit. Throughout the season, we're going to evolve. So we're trying to really plan out these episodes thoughtfully because we know there's maybe going to be more questions with this scripture, with these thoughts and ideas that we have about God. So we want to try and plan for that each time we get ready to record, that we have done our work for you all, whether it's work with Taylor, work with the Bible. We want to make sure that our product is wonderful and gives you guys joy, because it gives us a lot of joy to do this. So our release schedule is going to be different this time. Last time it was every week that we did it. We also discovered that's not sustainable for the two of us, because we often don't do this until later in the day, which then means it needs to be a quick turnaround for Paige to work her magic to then get it up before midnight so we could still have that Wednesday posting.
Right.
Our hope is to do this every other week.
Yeah.
And our first episode is going to be in a couple weeks.
Yeah, we're aiming for February 7th, which means we'll be back with season 2 when Taylor is back on the Eras tour.
Yes, while she is in Japan dancing and singing away, you can be listening to a brand new episode of The Eras of God.
Yeah, and it's really, really exciting to be able to bring this to you and to be able to bring it to you with some of these adjustments. I think we learned a lot about the work it takes to prep and the post work, and I am very proud of the work we did on the first season.
So proud.
And we can always continue to grow. So that's part of what we're planning to do for this season. So stick with us. It'll be every other week. It'll also give you a little more time to listen, because our episodes ended up being longer than we expected.
Which really shouldn't be surprising to anyone that knows Paige or myself, because once we get talking about a topic that we are just so in love with and so excited about, we don't really stop.
Right.
So that will give us a chance to maybe give you a little bit longer of an episode to go more in depth with things that maybe we wanted to last season. I know we're going to have a lot of things to talk about with God, how we see God, how God is in this world of the Old Testament, because it's a very different world than we see God with Jesus in the Gospels.
Right. And it also allows us to look at a part of Scripture that maybe we're not as exposed to, or that we know in other ways, and to look more deeply at some of it.
Yeah.
If we dive into stories that have complex themes, we'll make sure to offer warnings about that. The Old Testament has a lot more of those stories than the stories of Jesus.
Yeah, and we will make sure that you know what's coming, that you're prepared for everything that we can prepare you for. We always want to make this a safe environment for you to tune into, for you to have enjoyment. We never want anyone that's listening to this to feel sad or hurt or, you know, something like that. So,
or unsupported.
Yeah, because as pastors, we never ever want to make someone feel unsupported or unloved. And that is really, I think, one of my goals is to show you how you can be so loved by God and find yourself and God in so many different things, including Taylor Swift's music.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, throughout time, people have used writing, music, storytelling to try to understand their place in the world and to understand the divine.
Yeah.
And for me, that's what Scripture is at its core.
Yeah.
It is people working out how they understand God's presence in their world. And it changes and has changed and grown over time. What we might say about a topic today is not how it would necessarily have been said when people were writing the Old Testament. I mean, these books were written
so long ago.
Right. I mean, thousands of years before Christ.
I mean, Jesus was around 2,000 years ago, which means the Old Testament is even farther back, because we know they talked about the Old Testament scripture while Jesus was walking the earth.
Right.
So they had to know that scripture. They had to know those books enough that they knew when Jesus came that the scripture was coming true.
Right. I mean, I think that the newest Old Testament scripture, and I will check this before we get to the episode where it's relevant, is probably 300 BCE. So it's 300 before the Common Era.
Yeah.
And so that's 300 years before Jesus.
Yeah, just a little bit ago.
Right. So this is a lot older, which means that the perspective that the writers are bringing to it is very different than our perspective today.
Yes.
And it's really important to acknowledge that. And scripture is something that the way we interpret it can be really, really divisive. It can be something that people have really strong feelings about. And so we also want to let you know where we're starting with that. As United Methodist pastors, taking the Bible literally is not really our practice.
Yeah.
We tend to try to take the scripture in the context in which it was written as much as we can, as much as we know, but also looking at it as being something written in a certain time and in a certain place.
Yep.
So there's a great quote that says, "I take the Bible too seriously to take it literally." And I don't remember if it's John Dominic Crossan or some biblical scholar said that. And I think it's really, really important because Scripture has a lot of depth. It has a lot of meaning to it. And when we take it literally, we strip it of the ability to find the literariness in it, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And I think something also really important to know is that every time you read scripture, you are going to look at it differently. You're going to see something different in it because of what you are going through personally, what is going on in the world, what you're maybe even listening to while you're reading the scripture. And there is nothing wrong with finding something different each time you look at the scripture. That's amazing because that shows that you have this open view of what you're reading. I mean, you read a book and you're going to read it differently every time you read it. You hear a Taylor song now and you hear it 6 months from now, you're going to maybe get something completely different. I mean, you saw that when we were doing our re-listens of, you know, when I heard this the first time, this is what I got. Oh, but when I listened to it, you know, 6 years later,
right,
all of a sudden I found this other part where, it was very naive when I was thinking about that, you know? And that's how we'll look at the scripture because the Old Testament is a little bit harder for me to preach from. I don't tend to go to it. There are certain stories that I love to preach about because I see myself in those scriptures, or I just thoroughly enjoy those stories. So I know I'm going to find new things in here because I have probably not sat down with the Hebrew Bible in depth like what we're going to do since seminary.
Right.
And this was probably one of my hardest classes in seminary because you don't really look at the Old Testament when you're in church. You tend to look at the New Testament. You want to look at the happy, shiny things, even though there's not always happy, shiny in New Testament, but it's not as evident in the Old Testament. I mean, look at Job, look at Leviticus. Like, there are just some books where you're just like, there was not a lot of good happening.
Right. And that's a challenge, right? And I have tended in my ministry to try to take some time in each calendar year, each liturgical year, to spend a little bit of time in the Old Testament, because there are really interesting stories. There are parts of the scripture where you're like, wait, they experienced that too? And oh my gosh, what happened to make them need to write that law?
Yeah.
Or some of that. Now, we are going to try to let you know where we'll be focusing, where we'll be starting, in case you want to read along. You're welcome to listen along with us as well. Obviously, we'll listen to each album leading up to recording the episodes. But you don't have to.
No.
We know we've got people who have a strong history with church who listen, and we know we have people who don't. And so we'll try our best to tell you the stories.
Yes. But if you want to read along, there are so many different places that you can find that. There are apps for your phone that you can do. Bible Gateway is fantastic that you can read it on that way. If you want to know where to find a great translation, or one that Paige and I just love and is the one that we always grab, send us a DM and we will be happy to help you find that resource.
Yeah. And it really, I hope, offers you a chance to learn some new stuff, to spend some time in a part of scripture that maybe you haven't spent time in, and hopefully find there the message of love and hope that, of God. I mean, the gift for me, the gift of the Old Testament is, it's broad, but one piece is, this is the scripture Jesus studied, right? Like, as Christians, Jesus is, kind of important. Just a little bit. Just a little. And so this is why, part of why it matters is Jesus, this was his texts, right?
Yeah.
But the other piece is that there's so much here, and there's so much growth. We see a view of God in Genesis that evolves and grows and changes by the time we get to Malachi.
Yeah.
And an understanding of God's presence with us and in our lives that shifts and grows. We also see how God responds to people and our needs. And so there really is a lot there. And I just love that we see this evolution. I said that about Taylor's albums. I feel the same way.
Yeah, and I know we'll see that looking at it. So you're probably like, okay, guys, just get to let us know what we're starting with. So we will be starting with Debut. So you can listen to that. And we will be starting in the beginning with Genesis.
Yeah. And I hope that if you have an opportunity to read it, enjoy it, at least the best you can. There's some challenging stories in there, and some of it can be complex because of the way it was collected. That's the other thing we wanted to cover, was just real quick where scripture came from.
Yeah.
So these stories were written by people, I said this earlier, who are trying to understand God and the world around them. And they were collected by another group of people who found value in these stories, and sometimes edited them so that multiple versions of one story either get jammed together or are told multiple times.
Yeah.
And they are a work of human hands. This is like our preaching, right? It's people working out how we understand God.
Yes, it's a collection of books and stories that have been passed down through generations and generations, organized into a bound book that we now use as one of our resources to be closer to God.
Right. Yep. And I think that's important that it's a resource that we have. And so we hope also to introduce you to another part of that resource.
Yeah, yeah. And just like we did last season, one of the things we're going to try and do for each album again is our Tay verb is what we're going to call it. Sort of like a proverb or a psalm that you would find in the Bible.
And the question this time isn't, is there a verse that has guided you, a life verse, but instead, is there a verse, a part of a song that helps, that speaks to your understanding of God or your relationship with God?
Yes.
So I think yours probably leans more toward relationships. So which one do you have?
So mine, ironically enough, is from Debut. Is I'm only me when I'm with you. And when Paige was talking about what we were going to do, this was the first song that came to mind. Because God knows who I am. He is the only one that knows me fully, everything about me. And I know I am my most self when I'm projecting that. And specifically the verses that when I was looking at the song, I looked at them and I just highlighted them and Paige was like, yep. And I don't try to hide my tears, my secrets or deepest fears. Through it all, nobody gets me like you do. And that is all of me. My tears that I've had throughout all of this, my secrets of, all of the things, and then my deepest fears of, am I good enough for this? Can I do this? Are you sure, God? And through it all, nobody gets me like you do.
Yeah.
Like,
that's awesome.
Really, Megan? Again, you're asking this again. You should know this by now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what is yours?
Well, mine is from a later album, and it's from Mirrorball.
Yeah.
And I know that I shared when we did that episode the book by Reba Riley about her post-traumatic church syndrome. And she was the one who introduced me to this idea of God as a disco ball, is what she says. But I remember feeling this the first time I heard Mirrorball. So it's the very last, it's the end of the song. It says, I'm a mirror ball. I'll show you every version of yourself tonight. Because how we see God, how we understand God is often a reflection of who we are and where we are at a particular time. And that if that has changed or grown over time, it's okay.
Yeah.
And so the other versions of ourselves and our understandings of God still have value.
Yes. Yes.
So I think that's, that's a little preview of what we're doing. Again, we'll be back with Debut. We're hoping on February 7th.
Yes.
And we are so excited to re-enter this journey and help you see and introduce you all to the eras of God.
Yes. So we will see you in February.
Thank you. Have a great night. Have a great night.